The slap echoed through the diner. Coffee hit the floor. No one moved. Not the man at the counter.
Oh, God,
Not the
no.
workers in the corner. Not even the young deputy who knew better. Because in this town, people had learned the cost of getting involved. But at the corner table, a man in a green Navy SEAL uniform sat still. No anger, no reaction, just watching. Beneath him, a trained German shepherd tightened like a loaded weapon, waiting for a single word that never came. The man with the badge smiled. He thought silence meant fear. He thought control meant power. He was wrong. Because the one man who didn't move
stay out of my way.
was the only one who didn't need to. And in a few moments, everything in this town was about to
Finish,
change.
Sheriff.
Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. If this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The wind arrived before the man did. It came rolling in from the gray Atlantic, dragging with it the sharp bite of salt and the hollow chill of late winter, slipping through the narrow streets of a small coastal town in Alaska, where buildings leaned slightly from years of enduring storms and silence. Snow clung stubbornly to the edges of sidewalks and the roofs of low wooden structures, not fresh enough to be beautiful, not old enough to be ignored, just lingering like something unresolved. The town itself felt paused, as if it had learned long ago that drawing attention was a risk better avoided. Cars moved slowly, conversations stayed low, and even the flickering neon sign of a roadside diner seemed unsure whether it should keep glowing or give up entirely. Into that quiet, a truck engine cut through the air, low and steady, tires crunching over gravel as it rolled into the diner's parking lot. The vehicle was old but well-maintained, the kind that suggested function over pride. The engine idled for a moment longer than necessary, as if the man inside was listening, not to the radio, not to anything obvious, but to the rhythm of a place he had never been before. Then the door opened. Caleb Vance stepped out into the cold wearing a full Navy SEAL combat uniform in deep green, the fabric matte and worn just enough to show it had seen use, not display. There were no insignias, no name tapes, nothing to explain who he was or where he belonged, which somehow made the uniform feel heavier rather than lighter. He was 37, tall with a lean, controlled build that did not advertise strength until it needed to, his posture naturally upright without stiffness. His dark brown hair was cut short in a strict military style, practical and unremarkable, while his steel blue eyes carried a kind of quiet calculation that never quite rested. A faint scar traced along the edge of his jaw, pale against the cold, reddened skin, like a memory that had decided not to fade. Caleb did not look around in a way that invited curiosity, but he noticed everything. The position of the diner windows, the angle of the lone patrol car parked near the side, the absence of movement where there should have been some. At his side moved Atlas. The German shepherd was 6 years old, his coat a deep blend of black and dark tan that seemed to absorb the weak winter light rather than reflect it. His frame was powerful but precise, every step measured, every shift of muscle controlled by discipline rather than instinct alone. His amber eyes were alert without appearing restless, scanning not for noise, but for intent. Atlas was not a pet. He was a partner shaped by years of training, the kind of animal that understood silence as both a command and a weapon. A simple tactical collar rested around his neck, worn but reliable, and though there was no leash, he stayed exactly where he needed to be, neither ahead nor behind. Together they crossed the lot and pushed through the diner door, the bell above it giving a thin, tired chime that barely carried across the room. Warmth met them first, followed by the smell of burnt coffee and grease that had settled too deeply into the walls to ever leave. The diner was narrow, lined with cracked vinyl booths and a long counter whose surface had been wiped so many times it had lost any sense of shine. Conversations existed, but only just, low murmurs, careful words, the kind of sound people make when they have learned that being heard can be dangerous. Behind the counter stood Clara Whitfield. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender with a posture that seemed slightly curved inward, as if she had spent years trying not to take up too much space. Her light brown hair was pulled back into a loose tie that had already begun to slip, strands falling softly around a face marked by faint freckles and tired green eyes. There was a gentleness in her expression, but also something guarded, a quiet awareness that measured every interaction before it fully formed. Clara had once been more open, more willing to meet the world head-on. But time, and a failed marriage that had left her raising a child alone, had taught her caution. She moved efficiently, politely, offering small smiles that never quite reached her eyes, because in places like this, kindness often came with a cost. Caleb chose a booth near the corner, his back naturally positioned toward the wall, giving him a clear view of the room without making it obvious that he was watching. Atlas slipped beneath the table and lay down, his body still but ready, chin resting lightly against the floor, as if he were nothing more than a shadow cast by the furniture. When Clara approached, Caleb ordered simply, his voice calm and even, not inviting conversation, but not dismissive either. She nodded, jotting it down, her gaze lingering for half a second longer than usual on the uniform, before she turned away. At the far end of the counter sat Noah Briggs, a young deputy barely in his mid-20s, his uniform crisp in a way that suggested he still believed appearances mattered. He had short blonde hair, neatly combed, and a clean-shaven face that had not yet learned how to hide uncertainty. Noah's posture was upright, almost rigid, his hands resting flat against the counter as though he were trying to anchor himself. He had grown up believing that law and order meant something clear and dependable, but lately, that belief had begun to shift, not in loud ways, but in quiet doubts that lingered longer than they should. His eyes flicked once toward Caleb, curiosity mixing with something else, something closer to unease, before he looked back down at his coffee. The diner continued as it always did, which was to say carefully. Plates clinked softly, a chair scraped once and then stilled, and outside the wind pressed faintly against the windows like it was trying to listen in. Caleb ate when his food arrived, slow and methodical, his movements economical, each action carrying the efficiency of habit. Beneath the table, Atlas accepted a small portion without sound, chewing with controlled restraint, his focus never drifting far from the rhythm of the room. Nothing had happened yet. And yet something had already begun. It was in the way Clara avoided looking toward the door for too long, in the way Noah's shoulders tensed at every passing car, in the way the entire diner seemed to exist in a state of anticipation, like a held breath waiting for a reason to release. Caleb did not need confirmation to recognize it. He had seen it before, in different places, under different names. The pattern was always the same. Silence shaped by fear, sustained by habit, reinforced by the belief that nothing would change. He finished his meal without haste, placing his utensils down with quiet precision. For a moment, he remained seated, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. Then, as if the decision had already been made long before he arrived, he shifted slightly, his attention settling not on any single person, but on the room as a whole. Atlas lifted his head just enough to meet that shift, ears flicking forward, reading the subtle change in posture like a language only the two of them spoke. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling faintly against the glass. Inside, the diner held its breath. And Caleb Vance, in his green Navy SEAL uniform that refused to belong quietly, simply watched, because sometimes the first move was not action, but understanding exactly when the moment would come. The door did not slam when it opened, but the air changed as if something heavier than a man had entered. Cold followed him inside, dragging the scent of snow and authority, and conversations that had barely existed before thinned into nothing at all. Boots struck the floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm, not hurried, not uncertain, but practiced in the way power becomes habit when it goes unchallenged for too long. Dalton Rourke did not need an introduction, because the room had already given him one. He was in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders with a body that had once been strong, but had softened into something heavier, less disciplined. His dark hair, streaked with gray, was combed back too neatly, as if control could be forced into place through routine. His face carried the marks of years spent drinking more than he admitted. The skin around his nose and cheeks flushed permanently, his eyes small and restless, always searching not for danger, but for submission. His uniform fit well enough, though worn in ways that suggested it belonged more to him than to the law he represented. The badge on his chest caught the dim light, but it did not shine. It simply existed, like everything else in the room that had learned not to draw attention. He did not greet anyone. He did not need to. He moved to the counter and took a seat, as if the space had been waiting for him, his hand resting near his sidearm in a casual gesture that was not meant to threaten, but to remind. Clara Whitfield saw him before she allowed herself to react, her shoulders tightening for a fraction of a second before she forced them back into place. The coffee pot in her hand trembled once, barely noticeable, but enough that she shifted her grip to steady it. She approached with the same quiet politeness she gave everyone, though there was something more careful in her steps now, something measured in the way a person walks when they know the ground beneath them is not stable. At the far end of the counter, Noah Briggs straightened slightly, his spine stiffening as if responding to a command he had not consciously heard. His eyes flicked toward Rourke, then quickly away, but not before something unsettled passed through them. Respect was expected. Fear was learned. And somewhere between the two, Noah was beginning to lose his footing. Caleb Vance did not turn his head. He did not need to. The reflection in the diner window, faint and distorted, gave him enough. The shift in the room told him the rest. Atlas remained beneath the table, but the dog's breathing had changed, slower, deeper, his body coiled with a quiet readiness that did not move outward, only inward, tightening like a drawn line waiting for release. Caleb's boot rested lightly against the dog's side, not pressing, not commanding, just there, a silent anchor that Atlas understood without needing instruction. Clara reached the counter and set the mug down in front of Rourke, her movements precise, controlled. "Coffee," she said softly, her voice steady in a way that had taken years to learn. Rourke did not thank her. He did not look at her either, at least not immediately. He lifted the mug, took a slow sip, then placed it back down with a small, deliberate sound. It was not loud, but it carried. "You're late today," he said, his voice low, edged with something that might have been humor if it had not been so empty. Clara blinked once, her expression unchanged, though her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of the coffee pot. "I'm on time?" she replied, careful, neutral. Rourke smiled then, a thin curve that did not reach his eyes. "Your time isn't what matters." The words hung in the air, not directed at anyone else, but heard by everyone. Noah shifted on his stool, his jaw tightening, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere just past the counter, as if looking directly at the exchange would make him part of it. Clara nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because she understood the difference. She turned slightly, intending to step away, to let the moment pass as it always did, quiet and survivable. And for a second, it seemed like it might. Then her elbow brushed the edge of the coffee pot. The movement was small. The consequence was not. A thin arc of dark liquid spilled across the counter, a few drops landing on Rourke's sleeve. Time did not stop, but it slowed, stretching just enough for every person in the diner to see exactly what had happened and exactly what would follow. Clara froze, the apology already forming on her lips before the sound could exist. The slap came fast and sharp, a crack that cut through the room like something breaking that could not be repaired. Clara's head snapped to the side, her body shifting half a step before she caught herself, one hand rising instinctively toward her cheek, but stopping just short of touching it. The mark bloomed almost immediately, red against pale skin, undeniable in its clarity. No one moved. Noah's hands tightened against the counter, his knuckles paling as the pressure built. But he did not stand. His training told him what should happen. His reality told him what would not. The distance between those two things felt wider than it ever had before. Caleb saw everything. He saw the angle of Rourke's arm, the weight behind the strike, the way Clara's body absorbed it without resistance. He saw the reactions around the room, the eyes that dropped, the shoulders that curved inward, the silence that followed like a second impact. He did not move. Because he was counting. The camera in the corner, still active, its small red light steady. The positions of the witnesses, their lines of sight clear, unobstructed. The timing of the act, unprovoked, undeniable. Atlas felt the shift before anyone else. The dog's muscles tightened, his body rising a fraction before stopping, held in place not by force but by trust. A low vibration built in his chest, not quite a growl, but something close, something restrained. Caleb's foot pressed lightly, just enough. Stay. Rourke stood slowly, his expression unchanged, as if what he had done required no acknowledgement beyond the act itself. "Watch what you're doing," he said, his voice louder now, meant to carry, meant to settle into memory. Clara swallowed, her throat working against the words she wanted to say, and the ones she knew she had to. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The apology did not belong to her, but it served its purpose. It always had. Caleb's gaze remained steady, not on Clara, not on Rourke, but on the space between them, where the truth of the moment existed without interpretation. He could end it. He knew exactly how. The distance, the timing, the outcome. It would take less than a second. But that was not the fight. The diner held its breath, the silence heavier now, no longer just fear, but something closer to recognition. Not everyone understood what they were seeing, but something in the air had shifted, subtle but real, like the first crack in ice that had seemed solid for too long. Rourke looked around the room, his gaze moving from face to face, searching for reaction, for defiance, for anything that would justify what came next. He found none. His eyes passed over Caleb for a moment, pausing just long enough to register the uniform, the stillness, the lack of submission. Something flickered there, brief and unreadable, before he looked away. And Caleb Vance, still seated, still silent, continued to watch, because the sound that mattered most had already been made, and everything that followed would grow from it. The diner did not return to normal after the slap. It only pretended to. Sound came back in fragments, a spoon touching ceramic, the low hum of the heater, the quiet shuffle of boots against worn linoleum. But something essential had shifted beneath it all, like a structure that had taken a crack too deep to ignore. People moved again, but carefully, each motion measured, as if the air itself had become something fragile that might break under the wrong weight. Clara Whitfield stood behind the counter with her back straight in a way that did not come naturally, one hand resting lightly against the surface as she wiped away the spilled coffee with slow, deliberate strokes. The redness on her cheek had begun to settle into a darker shade, no longer shocking, but still impossible to hide. Her expression had returned to its practiced calm, though something behind her eyes had changed, something quieter but sharper, like a line drawn where there had once been only endurance. She did not look at Dalton Rourke again. Not directly. Not yet. But she no longer looked away as quickly as before, either. Rourke remained at the counter, finishing his coffee with the same unhurried confidence he had entered with, though the edges of that confidence had shifted into something less stable. He was not afraid. Fear was not a language he spoke easily. But he was irritated, and irritation, for a man like him, was often more dangerous. His gaze moved across the diner again, slower this time, searching not just for submission, but for something else. Something that did not fit the pattern he had built over years of control. He found it in Caleb Vance. The man in the green Navy SEAL uniform had not moved. He had not reacted. He had not lowered his eyes or offered the quiet signals of compliance that Rourke was used to reading without effort. Caleb sat exactly as he had before, shoulders relaxed, posture balanced, his presence neither confrontational nor yielding. It was not defiance in the way Rourke understood it. It was something more unsettling than that. It was the absence of fear without the need to prove anything. Rourke watched him longer than he should have. Long enough that others noticed. even if they did not dare to follow his gaze directly. There was a tension in that silence, thin but growing, like a thread pulled just tight enough to threaten snapping. Atlas felt it first. The German shepherd lifted his head slightly from beneath the table, amber eyes locking onto the shift in energy before any words were spoken. His body remained still, but the stillness was no longer passive. It had direction now, a focus that narrowed toward the man at the counter. His ears angled forward, catching the smallest changes in movement, the subtle shift of weight in Rourke's stance, the way his hand hovered just a fraction closer to his belt. Caleb did not look down at the dog. He did not need to. The connection between them was not visible, but it was constant, a quiet understanding built through repetition and trust. His breathing remained steady, his expression unchanged, but his awareness had sharpened, narrowing just enough to account for what might come next without rushing toward it. At the far end of the counter, Noah Briggs felt the moment settle into him like something physical. He had seen confrontation before, had been trained to respond to it, to step in, to de-escalate, to enforce the boundaries that were supposed to define right and wrong. But this was different. There were no raised voices, no immediate threat that could be pointed to and labeled. There was only presence, and the weight of it. Noah's gaze moved, almost against his will, from the counter to Caleb. He studied him in a way he had not allowed himself to before, noticing the details he had overlooked earlier. The uniform, worn but precise. The posture, relaxed but ready. The stillness, not empty but controlled. Caleb did not look like someone waiting for permission. He looked like someone who did not require it. Something in Noah's chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition of a possibility he had not considered before. That authority did not always come from a badge. That strength did not always announce itself. That there were ways to stand in a room without bending, even when everything around you expected it. Rourke shifted in his seat, the movement small but deliberate, his boots scraping softly against the floor as he turned slightly to face Caleb more directly. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach beyond the two of them. It was not a question. It was an assertion, one that demanded acknowledgement, even if it did not ask for it. Caleb met his gaze then, fully, without hesitation, without challenge, but without retreat. "No," he replied, his tone even, giving nothing more than the word itself. The simplicity of it landed harder than anything more elaborate could have. Rourke's eyes narrowed slightly, his irritation sharpening as he searched for something in Caleb's response that he could use, something to push against, something to turn into control. But there was nothing there. No excess, no weakness, no invitation. "Passing through," Rourke continued, leaning back slightly as if settling into a conversation he intended to own. "Yes." Again, nothing more. Around them, the diner listened without appearing to. Clara's movement slowed, her attention drawn despite herself, the cloth in her hand pausing against the counter. Noah held his breath without realizing it, the tension in his shoulders building as he waited for something to break. Rourke smiled then, but it was not the same smile he had worn before. This one was thinner, tighter, edged with something that had begun to shift from confidence into something less certain. "You picked the wrong place," he said. Caleb did not respond immediately. He let the words sit between them, not rejecting them, not accepting them, simply allowing them to exist without weight. Then, after a moment, he spoke. "I don't think so." The room seemed to contract around that sentence. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. But it did something the others had not. It refused to agree. It refused to bend. Rourke's hand moved just slightly, resting more firmly against his belt now, his fingers brushing the edge of his holster in a gesture that was almost casual, almost unconscious, but not quite. His gaze did not leave Caleb's face. "You should," he said, his voice lower now, the humor gone from it entirely. Caleb held that gaze without shifting, his expression unchanged, his posture steady. There was no challenge in him, no escalation. There was also no retreat. He existed in that space exactly as he had chosen to, and that choice was something Rourke could not control. Atlas remained beneath the table, his body coiled in silence, every line of him ready, but held in place by a discipline stronger than instinct. His eyes flicked once to Caleb, then back to Rourke, tracking the exchange in a way that mirrored his handler's awareness, precise and unwavering. Noah felt something inside him shift again, deeper this time. The rules he had learned, the structure he had trusted, did not account for this. They did not explain how a man could sit in front of authority and simply not yield, not out of defiance, but out of certainty. It was not loud. It was not heroic. But it was real. And that made it dangerous in a way he was only beginning to understand. Clara's hand tightened slightly around the cloth she held, her gaze lifting just enough to meet Caleb's reflection in the glass behind the counter. For a brief moment, something passed between them. Not a signal, not an agreement, just an acknowledgement that what had happened earlier had not been invisible. That someone had seen. That someone had not looked away. Rourke stood then, the movement abrupt enough to draw the attention of the entire room even as they tried to pretend otherwise. He dropped a few bills onto the counter, more than necessary, not out of generosity, but out of habit, the kind that came from knowing no one would question him either way. He stepped closer to Caleb, not enough to touch, but enough to crowd the space, to test the boundary that had been drawn without words. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them held, thin and deliberate, like a line neither had yet crossed. Then Rourke turned, breaking the moment himself, though the tension did not leave with him. He walked toward the door, his presence receding in steps that felt heavier than when he had entered. The bell rang again as he pushed it open, the cold air rushing in briefly before the door closed behind him. The diner exhaled, but it was not relief, not entirely, because something had changed. And Caleb Vance, still seated, still composed, had not lowered his eyes once. Morning came without color. The sky a flat sheet of gray that pressed low over the town as if it intended to stay. Snow drifted in thin, patient lines, settling into the edges of roofs and the grooves of the street, softening nothing, only covering what had already been worn down. The diner's neon sign flickered once before holding steady, its weak glow cutting through the dull light like a habit that refused to break. Inside, the warmth returned as it always did, but it felt different now, less like comfort and more like a space waiting for something to finish unfolding. Clara Whitfield arrived earlier than usual. She unlocked the door with hands that moved carefully, not because she was uncertain, but because she was aware of every small action in a way she had not been before. The bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight, spreading faintly along the bone beneath her eye, impossible to ignore but no longer fresh enough to shock. She did not try to hide it. That was new. Her posture remained slightly guarded, her shoulders drawn inward out of habit, but there was a steadiness in her movements now, a quiet refusal to shrink any further. She moved behind the counter, setting things in place with deliberate precision, as if control over small details might anchor something larger that had begun to shift inside her. Edgar Lowell stood near the back of the diner, by the small office door that most customers never noticed. He was in his early 60s, tall once but now slightly stooped, his frame thinned by years of work and the slow weight of time. His gray hair was uneven, cut more out of necessity than care, and his hands bore the marks of a life spent fixing things that were not meant to last. There was a quiet patience to him, the kind that came from learning when to speak and when to remain still. But beneath it lived something harder, something that had been building quietly for years without ever finding a place to go. He had watched everything the night before. Not just the slap, but the silence that followed it, the way it settled into the room like something familiar. He had seen it before, too many times to count, each moment folding into the next until they became something indistinguishable. But last night had been different, not because of what happened, but because of who had seen it. Edgar's gaze shifted toward the front of the diner as the door opened again. Caleb Vance stepped inside, the same green Navy SEAL uniform worn without explanation, without apology. Snow clung lightly to his shoulders, melting slowly as the warmth reached him, leaving darkened patches on the fabric. Atlas followed at his side, his coat dusted with white, his movements as controlled as ever, though his eyes carried a sharper focus than before, as if something in the town had already been marked. Caleb did not pause. He did not scan the room in any obvious way. He simply moved to the same booth as before, his back to the wall, his presence settling into the space with the same quiet certainty. Atlas slid beneath the table, lowering himself into position, though his head remained lifted slightly higher this time, his attention more active, less at rest. Clara approached, her expression composed, though her eyes met Caleb's for a brief moment longer than they had the day before. There was no gratitude in that look, no expectation, just acknowledgement. "Coffee?" she asked softly. "Yes," Caleb replied. Nothing more was needed. At the far end of the diner, Noah Briggs sat again at the counter, though his posture had changed. He was no longer rigid in the same way, no longer trying to hold himself together through discipline alone. There was a tension in him now, but it moved differently, less contained, more uncertain. His eyes lifted when Caleb entered, following him for a second before dropping again, though not as quickly as before. Something in him had shifted, and he did not yet know what to do with it. Edgar watched all of this from the back, his mind turning over something he had avoided for too long. He had told himself, again and again, that survival meant silence, that keeping his business running, keeping his head down, was enough. But silence, he was beginning to understand, did not erase anything. It only stored it. And he had been storing things for years. He moved then, slowly, wiping his hands against a cloth before stepping toward Caleb's booth. His gait was careful, not hesitant, but measured, as if each step carried more weight than it should. When he reached the table, he stopped, not sitting, not yet speaking. Caleb looked up at him, his expression neutral, his attention immediate. "You're not just passing through," Edgar said finally, his voice low, roughened by age and disuse. It was not an accusation. It was a recognition. Caleb did not answer right away. He held Edgar's gaze for a moment, assessing not the words, but the intent behind them. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, already folded once. He placed it on the table between them, not pushing it forward, not explaining it. Just leaving it there. Edgar looked at it but did not pick it up. "That's supposed to mean something." "It's a number," Caleb said. "That's all?" "Yes." The simplicity of it unsettled Edgar more than anything else could have. There was no promise attached to it, no guarantee, no explanation of what would happen if it was used. Just a path, offered without pressure. Edgar exhaled slowly, his eyes dropping to the paper again before lifting toward the back of the diner, toward the small office door that most people ignored. For a moment he said nothing, his mind moving through years of decisions, of moments he had chosen not to act, not to speak. Then something in his posture shifted, subtle but final. "Come with me," he said. Caleb stood without hesitation. Atlas rose with him, falling into place at his side, his body alert but controlled. Clara watched them from behind the counter, her hands stilling against the surface as they moved past, her gaze following not openly, but enough to know something was happening. Noah glanced over as well, his curiosity sharpening, though he did not move. Not yet. The office was small, dimly lit, the air inside carrying the faint scent of dust and old paper. A metal cabinet stood against the wall, its surface marked by scratches and years of use. Edgar stepped toward it, his hands steady now as he reached for the handle and pulled it open. Inside were stacks of envelopes and small drives, each labeled in careful handwriting, dates and brief notes marking moments that had been meant to disappear. Edgar reached in and pulled out a handful, setting them on the desk with a quiet weight that seemed heavier than the objects themselves. "He told me to erase them." Edgar said, his voice flat. Not bitter, not angry, just honest. Every time. Caleb said nothing. He did not need to. I did, Edgar continued, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips for a second. On the system. But I kept copies. The words hung in the room. Not dramatic, not loud, but final. Caleb stepped closer to the desk, his gaze moving over the labels, the dates, the quiet record of things that had not been allowed to exist. He did not reach for them. He did not inspect them. He only acknowledged them with a slight shift in his posture, as if confirming something he had already known. Edgar watched him, waiting for a reaction, for a question, for anything that might tell him what came next. None came. Is it enough? Edgar asked. Caleb looked at him then, his expression unchanged, his voice steady. It's a start. Edgar nodded slowly, the answer settling into him in a way that felt both heavier and lighter at the same time. He glanced once more at the paper still in his hand, the number written in simple, clear digits. No one had forced him to take it. No one had told him what to do with it. But it was there. And for the first time in years, that felt like something more than silence. The afternoon settled over the town like a weight that refused to lift, the gray sky pressing lower as the wind sharpened, pushing thin sheets of snow across the road in restless streaks. Inside the diner, the light remained steady, but the air carried a tension that had not faded since morning. It had only changed shape, stretching thinner, tighter, waiting. Caleb Vance sat in the same booth, the green Navy SEAL uniform still marking him as something that did not belong, though by now it had become less of a curiosity and more of a quiet disturbance in the pattern of the room. He had not rushed. He had not moved differently. But his presence had begun to settle into the space like a fixed point, something that could not be ignored even when people tried not to look. Atlas lay beneath the table, his body still, though the stillness had shifted again, no longer passive, no longer simply aware. It carried anticipation now, the kind that came before movement. Clara Whitfield moved behind the counter with a rhythm that was almost steady, though her attention drifted more often than it should have. Her cheek still held the fading trace of the bruise, now softened at the edges, but not gone. She worked as she always did, careful, polite, controlled, yet there was a difference in how she held herself. Less folded inward, more balanced, as if something inside her had begun to resist the shape it had been forced into for too long. At the far end, Noah Briggs remained at his place, though he had not touched his coffee in several minutes. His hands rested flat on the counter, fingers slightly spread, as if grounding himself in something solid while his thoughts moved too quickly to follow. He had not spoken since morning, and no one had asked him to. The silence suited the room. It always had. The bell above the door rang again. This time, no one needed to look to know who had entered. Dalton Rourke stepped inside with the same slow certainty as before, though there was something different in the way he carried himself now. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone who did not know what to look for. His shoulders were set a fraction tighter, his movements less fluid, as if something had unsettled him in a way he could not fully place. He scanned the room once, not for acknowledgement, but for confirmation. His gaze found Caleb immediately. The man had not moved. That was the problem. Rourke walked toward the counter, then stopped halfway, his attention fixed, his path shifting without hesitation. The room seemed to narrow as he changed direction, the distance between him and Caleb closing with each step, measured, deliberate. Conversations died before they could begin. Clara's hands stilled against the counter. Noah's breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. Rourke stopped beside Caleb's table, close enough that his shadow fell across it. "Still here," he said, his voice low, though it carried farther than it should have. Caleb looked up, his expression unchanged, his posture exactly as it had been. "Yes." The single word landed without weight, without challenge, but without submission. Rourke's jaw tightened slightly. He studied Caleb more closely now, his eyes moving over the uniform, the lack of insignia, the absence of anything that tied the man to a system he could recognize, control, or manipulate. That absence irritated him more than open defiance ever could. "You like making people uncomfortable?" Rourke asked, his tone shifting, probing for something he could use. Caleb held his gaze. "No." Again, nothing more. The simplicity stripped the moment of anything Rourke could twist. It left him with only himself, and for a man who relied on control, that was a problem. "You think that outfit means something here?" Rourke continued, one hand settling near his belt, fingers brushing the edge of his holster in a gesture that had become instinct. "You think it gives you authority?" Caleb did not look down. He did not glance away. "No." The answer came the same as before, steady, final, unadorned. Rourke's irritation sharpened into something harder. He took a step closer, closing the space between them until it became personal, deliberate. "Then what exactly are you doing?" Caleb did not answer immediately. For a moment, he simply looked at Rourke, not searching, not measuring, just present in a way that did not shift. Then he spoke. "Sitting." The word broke something. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough. Rourke's hand moved before the thought had fully formed, driven by instinct more than decision. The strike came fast. A sharp, open-handed blow aimed to assert, to dominate, to restore the order he believed had been disrupted. It connected. Caleb's head turned slightly with the impact, his body absorbing the force without resistance, without retaliation. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to freeze, every movement suspended in the space between what had happened and what might follow. Atlas surged upward. The German shepherd moved with explosive precision, his body rising from beneath the table in a single, fluid motion, muscles tightening, weight shifting forward, a low, controlled growl building from deep within his chest. His eyes locked onto Rourke, not wild, not uncontrolled, but focused, calculating, ready. The distance between them vanished in intent, if not yet in action. Then Caleb spoke. One word. Quiet. Sharp. Absolute. Atlas stopped. Not gradually, not reluctantly, completely. His body froze mid-motion, tension still running through every line of him, but held in place by something stronger than instinct. His chest rose and fell once, twice, the growl fading into silence as he lowered himself back down, though his eyes never left Rourke. The control in that moment shifted the balance of the room more than the strike ever could. Caleb turned his head back slowly, his gaze returning to Rourke, his expression unchanged, his posture still relaxed, as if nothing had happened that required a different response. He did not raise his hands. He did not move to stand. Because he understood something Rourke did not. This was not a fight that would be won here. Not like this. Around them, the diner held its breath again, but it was different now. The silence was no longer empty. It carried weight, meaning, consequence. Clara's hand pressed lightly against the counter, her eyes wide, not with fear alone, but with something else. Something that had begun to take shape beneath it. Noah had half risen from his stool without realizing it, his body caught between action and restraint, his training colliding with a reality he could no longer ignore. Rourke stepped back, just slightly, the movement small but telling. His eyes flicked briefly to Atlas, then back to Caleb, recalculating, reassessing. The script had shifted, and for the first time, he was no longer entirely sure how it would end. "You're making a mistake," Rourke said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned. Caleb met his gaze, steady, unmoved. "No," he replied. And this time, the word carried weight, because the mistake had already been made. The arrest did not come with chaos. It came with procedure, with words spoken in a tone that tried to sound official enough to cover what everyone in the room already knew. The wind outside had grown sharper, pushing against the diner windows in uneven gusts, as if the storm had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Inside, Dalton Rourke's voice cut through the silence, steady on the surface, though something underneath it had begun to crack. "You're coming with me," he said, his hand already reaching for Caleb's arm, not asking, not explaining. Caleb did not resist. He stood slowly, his movements controlled, deliberate, giving nothing that could be turned against him. His eyes moved once across the room, not searching, not pleading, simply acknowledging. Clara met that glance for a fraction of a second, her breath catching in a way she could not control. Noah stood frozen near the counter, his body rigid, his thoughts racing too fast to follow. Edgar remained near the back, his hands clenched loosely at his sides, the weight of what he had already chosen settling deeper into him. Atlas rose the moment Caleb moved. The German shepherd stepped forward, his body aligned with his handler, muscles tight, ready, his gaze fixed on Rourke with a focus that did not waver. For a heartbeat, it looked as if the room might fracture completely. Then another voice entered. Deputy Carl Henson stepped through the doorway behind Rourke, summoned without ceremony. He was in his late 40s, heavier in build, his uniform stretched slightly across his frame, his posture carrying the quiet fatigue of a man who had learned to follow orders because resisting them had cost him more than he could afford. His face was lined, his eyes tired, but not empty. He had seen enough to know the difference between right and wrong, even if he no longer acted on it. "Take the dog," Rourke said without looking back. Carl hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, just enough to register as something more than obedience. Then he nodded once and stepped toward Atlas. He did not rush. He did not reach aggressively. He moved carefully, aware that what stood in front of him was not just an animal, but something trained, precise, capable. Atlas did not move. He did not growl. He simply stood, watching, his body still as stone, waiting. Caleb spoke then, his voice low, steady. "Stay." The word settled into Atlas like a command written into bone. The tension in the dog's body did not disappear, but it locked into place, contained, controlled. Carl reached for the tactical collar, his hands firm, but not rough, guiding Atlas toward the door. The dog followed without resistance, though his eyes never left Caleb, tracking him even as distance began to grow. The cuffs clicked into place around Caleb's wrists, the sound sharp, final. Rourke's grip tightened as he turned, leading him toward the exit. No one spoke. No one moved to intervene. The bell above the door rang again as it opened, the cold air rushing in, carrying with it the sound of a town that did not react, but absorbed. Outside, the cruiser waited, engine running, its presence as routine as everything else that had happened. Caleb was placed in the back seat, the door closing with a dull, heavy sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Atlas was led to a small fenced enclosure beside the station building across the street, a temporary holding space used for animals, its metal bars cold against the wind. Carl secured the latch, his movements efficient, though his gaze lingered on the dog for a moment longer than necessary. Atlas stood in the center of the enclosure, unmoving. Snow gathered lightly along his back, melting slowly into his coat, but he did not shake it off. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, his eyes fixed on the direction the cruiser had gone. He did not bark, he did not pace. He waited. Inside the diner, the silence remained, but it had changed. It was no longer the same silence that had followed the slap. This one carried something else, something less stable, less willing to settle back into place. Clara Whitfield stood behind the counter, her hands resting against the surface, as if she needed the contact to remain grounded. The image of Caleb being taken replayed in her mind, not as a moment of defeat, but as something unfinished. Her gaze shifted slowly toward the booth where he had been sitting. It was empty now, but not entirely. The small piece of paper remained, partially tucked beneath the edge of the table. She stared at it for a long moment, her breathing shallow, uneven. Her fingers tightened against the counter before she pushed herself forward, moving around the edge and stepping toward the booth. Each step felt louder than it should have, though no one stopped her, no one spoke. She reached the table and picked up the paper, her hand trembling just enough to make the motion uncertain. A number. Nothing more. Her thumb traced over it once, as if the act might reveal something hidden beneath the ink. It did not. It only remained what it was. A choice. At the counter, Noah Briggs had not moved since the cruiser left. His mind replayed everything he had seen, every moment, every detail, each one refusing to settle into the version of reality he had been taught to accept. He looked toward the door, then toward Clara, then finally down at his own hands. They were shaking. He stood abruptly, the motion breaking the stillness around him. No one stopped him as he stepped away from the counter and moved toward the back of the diner, his path uncertain, but driven by something he could no longer ignore. Edgar Lowell was already there, standing near the office door, the cabinet still open behind him. He looked at Noah as he approached, seeing in the younger man's expression something he recognized, something he had once felt and chosen to bury. "You saw it," Noah said, his voice low, strained. Edgar nodded. "I've seen worse." Noah swallowed, the words catching in his throat before forcing their way out. "It's all in there, isn't it?" He glanced toward the cabinet, toward the stacks of evidence that had never been meant to exist. Edgar followed his gaze, then looked back at him. "Enough." Noah hesitated, the weight of what he was about to do pressing against him from every direction. Then he stepped forward. "I can get into the system tonight," he said. "Some of it's still there. Not everything, but enough." Edgar studied him for a moment, measuring not the words, but the resolve behind them. Then he nodded once. "Then get it." Clara stood alone near the booth, the paper still in her hand. Her breathing slowed, steadied, as she looked toward the door, toward the place where Caleb had disappeared. For a long moment, she did nothing. Then she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating, the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. She could put it back. She could walk away. She could return to the counter and pretend none of this had changed. Instead, she dialed. The phone rang once, twice. She held it to her ear, her hand still trembling, though her posture had begun to straighten, just slightly. 3 people, in 3 different corners of the same small town, had made a choice. None of them looked like a threat. None of them carried power in the way Dalton Rourke understood it. But together, they had become something far more dangerous. Because they had stopped being silent. The town did not mark time the way it used to. It did not move from morning to night with the quiet predictability of routine. It stretched instead, each hour pulling thin like ice under pressure, each day settling heavier than the last. Snow continued to fall, not in storms, but in slow, persistent layers that covered the streets, the rooftops, the edges of everything people thought they understood. The wind carried less noise now, as if even it had learned to wait. On the first day, nothing appeared to change. The diner opened as it always did, the coffee brewed, the plates set, the same low murmur filling the space. Clara Whitfield moved behind the counter with steady hands, her bruise fading into yellow at the edges, her posture still careful, but no longer retreating. She spoke to customers in the same quiet tone, but there was something different in the way she held eye contact now, something firmer, less willing to break first. People noticed. They did not comment, not directly, but their glances lingered longer. Their voices carried a fraction more weight. It was not defiance. Not yet. But it was no longer submission either. Noah Briggs did not sit at the counter that morning. He arrived early, before the streets had filled, before the sky had decided whether it would lighten or remain gray. His uniform was still crisp, but his movements had changed, less rigid, more deliberate. He moved through the station quietly, aware of every sound, every flicker of light from the monitors lining the wall. The system was not built to be broken easily. It logged access, tracked entries, erased inconsistencies. But it had not been designed to stop someone who knew where to look and was willing to take the risk. Noah worked slowly, carefully, his fingers steady despite the tension running through him. Files appeared, disappeared, reappeared in fragments. Some were gone entirely. Others remained, hidden beneath layers meant to obscure them. He copied what he could. Not everything. Not enough to feel safe, but enough to matter. When he finished, he sat back for a moment, staring at the screen as if expecting it to change on its own. It did not. The evidence remained where he had placed it, no longer part of the system, but not yet part of anything else. On the second day, the silence in the town shifted. It was no longer empty. It carried something beneath it, something that moved quietly between people without needing words. Clara made the call again that morning, her voice steadier this time, her questions more direct. She did not speak loudly. She did not explain everything. But she spoke enough. Edgar Lowell did not open the diner that day. He stayed in the back office, the cabinet emptied onto the desk, each envelope opened, each piece of evidence reviewed with a focus he had not allowed himself before. His hands no longer shook when he touched them. The years he had spent storing those moments had given way to something else. Something that felt less like fear and more like release. He organized everything. Dates, names, times. Not for himself. For whoever would need to see it next. Outside, Atlas remained in the enclosure near the station. The snow had gathered deeper around the fence, the ground beneath him packed hard from where he stood. He had not lain down. Not once. His body remained upright, his posture unbroken, his gaze fixed on the road that led away from the building. People passed by, some slowing, some stopping briefly, their curiosity tempered by something they could not fully name. One of them was a woman named Sarah Whitaker, in her late 40s, tall and lean with dark hair threaded with gray, pulled back tightly at the nape of her neck. She worked at the local school, had for years, her life shaped by routine and quiet responsibility. A divorce had left her more guarded than she once was, less willing to trust easily, but not unkind. She paused across the street, her eyes settling on Atlas with a quiet intensity, recognizing something in the dog's stillness that mirrored something in herself. "Good dog," she said softly, not stepping closer, understanding instinctively that this was not an animal meant for strangers. Atlas did not respond. He did not need to. On the third day, the air changed again. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that those paying attention felt it. The station remained quiet through the morning. The usual movement slowed, conversations shorter, more controlled. Rourke had not appeared in public since the arrest. That alone was enough to unsettle the rhythm of the town. By midday, the cruiser door opened. Caleb Vance stepped out. There were no charges. No explanation offered. Just a release that carried more meaning in what it did not say than what it did. His wrists bore faint marks where the cuffs had pressed, but his posture remained unchanged, his expression steady, his presence exactly as it had been before. Atlas reacted before anyone else. The moment Caleb appeared, the dog moved, not breaking discipline, but shifting forward with a contained force that tightened every line of his body. The handler's voice came low and calm. "Easy." The words settled into Atlas immediately. The tension eased, not disappearing, but controlled, shaped back into stillness as Caleb approached and opened the enclosure. The latch clicked softly, the sound almost lost in the wind. Atlas stepped forward, closing the distance, his head lifting slightly as Caleb's hand came to rest briefly against his neck. No excitement. No noise. Just contact. Across the street, Sarah Whitaker watched, her expression unreadable, though something in her gaze lingered longer than before. She turned away only when Caleb did, continuing on her path as if nothing had happened, though the image remained with her. Caleb did not return to the diner immediately. He stood beside his truck for a moment, the cold air cutting cleanly across his face, the snow settling lightly on his shoulders. His gaze moved once across the town, not searching, not assessing in the way he had before, but acknowledging. He could leave. Nothing held him here, but something had started, and leaving now would mean abandoning it before it had a chance to become anything real. Atlas settled beside him, his posture relaxed but ready, his attention aligned with Caleb's without needing direction. The decision did not take long. It did not need to. Caleb opened the truck door, then paused, his hand resting briefly against the frame before he closed it again. He turned instead, stepping back toward the street, toward the diner, toward the place where everything had begun. He would not stay forever, but he would not leave yet. And in a town where silence had ruled for years, even that choice was enough to shift the ground beneath it. The snow began before anyone noticed the car. It fell in thin, deliberate lines, softening the edges of the road, settling along the roofs and the quiet spaces between buildings where conversations usually hid. The town moved as it always did, slow, careful, measured. But something beneath that routine had already shifted, something that no longer allowed silence to sit as comfortably as it once had. The vehicle arrived without announcement. A dark federal sedan turned off the main road and rolled into view, its tires pressing quietly into the fresh layer of snow, leaving tracks that did not rush, did not hesitate. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, no urgency in the way it moved. It carried none of the noise people had learned to associate with authority. Instead, it carried something else entirely. Finality. Clara Whitfield saw it first. She stood behind the counter, her hands resting lightly against the surface, her posture steadier now than it had been days before. The bruise on her cheek had faded into something faint, no longer dominating her reflection, but not gone either. It remained as a memory that did not ask to be forgotten. Her eyes lifted toward the window, following the slow approach of the sedan as it came to a stop across the street. For a moment, she did not move. Then she straightened, just slightly more than before. At the far end of the diner, Noah Briggs stood near the entrance, his uniform still crisp, though the man inside it had changed. The tension that once held him rigid had shifted into something steadier, something quieter, but more certain. He had not slept much in the past few days, but his eyes were clear now, focused in a way that did not waver. He watched the car through the glass, his breath slow, controlled, as if preparing for something he already knew was coming. In the back office, Edgar Lowell stood beside the empty cabinet, his hands resting against the edge of the desk where the envelopes and drives had once been. They were gone now. Given over. Released. For the first time in years, there was nothing left for him to hide. The absence felt strange, but not wrong. The car doors opened. 2 agents stepped out first, their movements efficient, unhurried, their presence carrying authority without needing to declare it. Behind them came a woman in her early 50s, tall, composed, her posture straight with the kind of certainty that did not rely on volume or force. Her name was Margaret Doyle. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, her coat buttoned high against the cold, her expression calm but exacting. She had spent decades in federal oversight, moving through places where systems failed and truths were buried, and she had learned long ago that the loudest voices were rarely the ones that mattered most. She did not look around. She did not need to. She walked straight toward the station. Across the street, Caleb Vance stood beside his truck, the green of his Navy SEAL uniform dark against the pale winter light. He had been there long enough to see the car arrive, long enough to understand what it meant without needing confirmation. Atlas stood at his side, his posture aligned, his gaze fixed on the same point, calm but alert, as if recognizing the shift even without knowing the details. Caleb did not move to follow. He did not need to witness what came next. Inside the station, Dalton Rourke stood behind his desk, his hands resting flat against the surface, his expression tight in a way that could no longer be hidden beneath routine confidence. He had felt the change before it arrived. The absence of control. The silence that no longer protected him. When the door opened, he looked up. Margaret Doyle entered without hesitation, the agent stepping in behind her. The room seemed smaller with them in it, not because they took up space, but because they did not give any back. "Sheriff Dalton Rourke," she said, her voice even, carrying authority without effort. Rourke straightened, his jaw tightening, his eyes moving briefly toward the agents, then back to her. "What is this?" he asked, though the question lacked conviction. Margaret held his gaze. "It's over." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Rourke's expression shifted, the anger rising first, then faltering as something else replaced it, something closer to realization. He opened his mouth as if to argue, to deny, to reclaim the ground he had stood on for so long. But the ground was already gone. The evidence had been seen. The silence had been broken. There was nothing left to hold on to. The agent stepped forward. The cuffs came out. The motion was simple, practiced, inevitable. Rourke did not resist. Outside, the town did not gather. No one rushed toward the station. No voices rose in celebration or outrage. The moment passed quietly, just as everything else had. But it was not the same quiet. Clara stood at the counter, watching through the window as the agents led Rourke out. Her hands did not tremble. Her shoulders did not fold inward. She stood straight, her gaze steady, meeting the moment without looking away. Noah stood just inside the diner door, his eyes following the scene, his breath slow, controlled. He did not feel relief the way he expected. He felt something else. Something steadier. Something that did not depend on the outcome, but on the choice that had led to it. Edgar stepped out from the back, joining them, his posture lighter than it had been in years, the weight he had carried finally set down. Across the street, Caleb Vance watched for a moment longer, his expression unchanged, his presence quiet as ever. Atlas stood beside him, still as a shadow, his gaze steady, his body relaxed, but ready. There were no words exchanged. None were needed. Caleb turned then, opening the truck door, pausing only long enough for Atlas to step in before following. The engine started with a low, familiar sound, steady and unremarkable. Snow continued to fall, softening the edges of the road as the truck pulled away, its movement calm, deliberate. No one called after him. No one needed to know his name, because what he had done did not belong to him alone. It belonged to the moment when silence stopped protecting the wrong people. And for the first time, the town did not look away.